There's a level 4 emergency activation happening in southern China right now. And the reason it matters to you isn't the weather. It's what this signals about a system that's quietly been stretched to its limit. Let me explain. Quick thing before we dive in. Drop the country you're watching from in the comments so I know where everyone's tuning in today. I actually read them. So there's a level 4 emergency response that just got activated in southern China. Hainan, Guangxi, Guangdong, 3 provinces, all under the same alert. The State Flood Control and Drought Relief Headquarters pulled the trigger, and the Ministry of Emergency Management made the announcement official. And on the surface, it's just a typhoon, a tropical system, seasonal flooding. Happens every year, right? But here's what caught my attention. Why does this matter to you? Not because of the rain, not because of the wind. It matters because of what it tells us about a government that's trying to manage something much bigger than water levels. Let me back up. The Chinese government operates on a 4-tier emergency response system. Level 4 is the lowest. It's basically their way of saying, we see it coming, we're paying attention, get ready. Routine stuff on paper. But the timing here is interesting. We're talking about a typhoon that hasn't even made landfall yet. The storm system is still out over the South China Sea, and they've already pulled the trigger on a multi-province response, which tells me they're not just worried about the storm. They're worried about the system's ability to handle it. And that's the part nobody's really talking about. Because here's the thing. China's been dealing with extreme weather all year. Record heat in some places, sudden violent floods in others. The Yangtze Basin had water levels that made officials nervous back in the spring. The Pearl River Delta, that's the economic heart of southern China, has been on edge since May. So when you see a level 4 activation across 3 provinces, it's not just a bureaucratic checkbox. It's a signal. Let me walk you through why this matters to you. Not because you're going to get wet, but because this is the kind of event that reveals cracks. And when a system as big as China's starts showing cracks, the effects ripple outward. Global supply chains, energy markets, food prices, the whole tangled web. Now ask yourself, why would they pull the trigger this early? The official answer is precautionary principle. That's what they always say. But I spent the morning going back through the actual emergency management playbook. And the threshold for a level 4 activation isn't that low. You need sustained winds above a certain speed. You need projected rainfall that exceeds drainage capacity. You need demonstrated flood risk to population centers. They don't just slap these designations on for fun, which means the data they're seeing, the satellite imagery, the weather models, the river gauges, is already crossing those thresholds. And here's a detail that almost every network missed. The activation covers the Guangxi Zhuang Autonomous Region. That's not just coastline, that's inland river systems, the Li River, the Hongshui. If they're worried about flooding in Guangxi, we're talking about water coming down from the mountains, rainfall that's going to accumulate over days, not hours. That's a different kind of threat. A coastal typhoon is violent but fast. It hits, it blows, it moves on. Inland flooding is slower, more insidious. It creeps up on people. It fills basements, undermines roads, isolates communities, and it's much harder to evacuate for. So why am I spending this much time on a storm in southern China? Because of what I just told you. This isn't just weather. This is a stress test, and we've seen this movie before. Do you remember the summer of 2021? That's when Hainan province got hit with a 1-in-1,000-year rainfall event. Zhengzhou, 20 centimeters of rain in an hour. Subways flooded. People died in their cars. The government took weeks to fully account for what happened. And that was a peacetime scenario. Normal year, no pandemic, no war, no major geopolitical tensions, just weather. Now fast forward to 2026. China's got a lot on its plate right now. The real estate market is still shaky. Local governments are drowning in debt. The youth unemployment numbers are, let's just say they're not publishing the full picture. And the Communist Party is heading into a critical year for internal planning. The kind of year where they don't want any distractions. And here comes a typhoon, aiming right at one of the most economically productive regions in the country. Guangdong alone accounts for about 10% of China's GDP. Think about that for a second. One province, 10%. That's bigger than the entire economy of Australia, and they just put it under a flood alert. Now, I'm not saying this storm is going to destroy Guangdong. I'm not saying the levees are going to fail. What I'm saying is the people in charge are nervous enough to pull the trigger early. And that tells me something about their confidence level. Because here's the thing. China's emergency management system has been through a lot in the last few years. They reformed it after the Hainan floods. They poured money into early warning systems. They improved coordination between the central government and the provinces. The Ministry of Emergency Management was supposed to be the fix, the new sheriff in town. But a system is only as good as the people running it. And the people running it, they're facing a crisis of legitimacy. Not in the way you might think. Not a collapse of authority, but a quiet erosion. The kind that happens when you ask a population to trust your warnings. And then the warnings don't match the reality on the ground. If the government says, we have this under control, and then the water starts rising faster than predicted, you lose something. A kind of faith, hard to measure, even harder to get back. And that's what worries me about this level 4 activation. Not the storm itself, the response to the storm. They're signaling early. They're signaling strongly. They want to be seen as proactive, as prepared. But if they overwarn, if they activate responses and then the storm weakens, they look like they were panicking. And if they underwarn and the storm strengthens, they look incompetent. It's a lose-lose, and they know it. So they're doing the only thing they can. They're throwing resources at the problem. They're mobilizing local officials. They're putting out media statements. They're making sure every provincial governor in the affected area knows their career depends on getting this right. And that pressure is real. Because in China, local officials are judged on performance, economic growth, social stability, disaster response. If a flood happens on your watch and you didn't do enough to prevent it, you don't just get a bad review, you get removed. So you better believe the governor of Guangdong is sitting in his office right now, staring at weather models, calculating his odds. And that's the human dimension of this, the part that gets lost in all the geopolitical analysis. There are people in those provinces, real people, farmers, factory workers, shopkeepers. They're not thinking about global trade routes. They're thinking about their homes, their kids, whether they need to move the livestock up the hill, whether the old roof is going to hold. And the government is trying to keep them safe, but also trying to keep them calm. And those two goals, they're not always the same. Now let's zoom out, way out, because this level 4 activation in southern China is happening at the same time as, well, everything else. The Middle East is still a pressure cooker. The war in Ukraine is grinding on. The U.S.-China relationship is at a delicate point. And the global food system is coming off 2 bad years in a row. So when I see a weather emergency in China's agricultural and manufacturing heartland, I don't just see rain. I see potential disruptions. Here's what could happen. If the typhoon hits hard, if the flooding is severe, you could see supply chain bottlenecks, not immediately, not visibly at first, but in the weeks and months after. The port of Guangzhou is one of the busiest in the world. If it slows down, if shipping gets delayed, American shelves feel that. Not dramatic, not apocalyptic, but a little thinner, a little pricier. And that's before we even talk about food. Guangxi is a major sugar producer. Guangdong grows rice. Hainan has tropical agriculture, bananas, rubber, the kind of crops that don't like their feet wet for too long. So you could see commodity prices react. Sugar, rice, natural rubber. Small movements, but in a global economy that's already jittery, small movements matter. Now, I'm not saying this is going to trigger a global crisis. I'm not saying the sky is falling. But I am saying when you see a government that big, with that much at stake, activating a response that early, you have to ask why. Because the official explanation is always going to be, we are being proactive. That's what they say every time. It's a bureaucrat's favorite word, proactive. It sounds responsible. It sounds in control. It also sounds like exactly what you'd say if you were scared. And here's the part that made me stop scrolling. The Ministry of Emergency Management, they didn't just issue the alert. They held a televised briefing. They put their officials on camera. They took questions. That's not routine. Usually these things are a press release, a line in the official newsletter, maybe a section on the evening news. But a full press conference before the storm even arrives? That's a signal to the international community as much as to the domestic population. They want to be seen as transparent, as responsive, as a government that takes care of its people. But the irony is, the more they try to project control, the more they reveal their anxiety. Think about it. If you were truly confident in your systems, if you knew the levees would hold, the drainage would work, the evacuation plans would succeed, would you call a press conference 3 days before landfall? Or would you just handle it quietly and let the results speak for themselves? Because the countries that are really good at disaster management, the ones that have it truly dialed in, they don't hold press conferences. They just execute. Japan, for example, when a typhoon hits Japan, they don't call a press conference. They activate their systems. They trust their infrastructure. They've proven it works. China hasn't proven that. Not fully, not yet. And that's the story. That's the thread I keep pulling on. This isn't about a typhoon. This is about a government that is still trying to prove to its own people and to the world that it can handle the basics, that it can protect its citizens, that its emergency management reforms are not just paperwork. Because in the end, that's what governance comes down to. Not grand ideology, not military power, the ability to keep people safe from the rain. That's the contract. That's the deal. And when the rain comes, we find out if the deal holds. Now I'm going to read you something from the actual emergency management code, the Chinese one. It's not classified. It's publicly available. But most people don't bother to look at it. Level 4 activation means local governments at all levels shall strengthen inspection of dangerous reservoirs, ensure flood storage capacity, and prepare emergency response forces. That's the language. Dry, technical, bureaucratic. But the phrase, ensure flood storage capacity, is doing a lot of work. Because in southern China, a lot of the reservoirs are operating near capacity. They've had a wet spring. The ground is already saturated. Any significant rainfall, and we're talking real risk. So the emergency activation isn't just about the typhoon. It's about the cumulative effect. The storm that tips the balance. The rain that finds the weakness in the infrastructure. The flood that overwhelms the drainage system. And that is a much more dangerous situation than a single weather event. This is where I want you to really pay attention, because the same dynamic exists in the United States. The same issues, the same questions. We have our own reservoirs, our own aging levees, our own floodplains that have been built up with development, our own emergency management systems that get tested every hurricane season. And the question is the same: are we ready? And the answer is, well, you know the answer. You've seen the footage. You've heard the stories. So when I watch China go through this, I'm not just watching China. I'm watching a system that looks like ours in a mirror. The same pressures, the same politics, the same human fallibility. And that's why I wanted to talk about this today. Not because I'm obsessed with Chinese politics, not because I'm a storm tracker, but because I think we need to understand what's happening in other countries if we want to understand what's happening in our own. The global system is connected. You know that, I know that. The supply chains, the food prices, the energy markets, the stability of governments, it's all one big tangle. And when something like this level 4 activation happens, it's not just a piece of news. It's a data point, a clue, a warning. Now let me tell you what I think is going to happen next. The storm is going to hit. It's going to be significant. Maybe not catastrophic, but significant. The Chinese government is going to respond. They're going to mobilize their resources. They're going to try to project competence. And the international media is going to cover it. They're going to show the footage, the rain, the flooding, the rescue workers in orange vests. But the coverage is going to miss the real story. The real story is what happens after the storm passes, the hidden damage, the infrastructure that got stressed but didn't fail, the reservoirs that got tested, the political careers that were made or broken, the confidence that was gained or lost. Because that's where the long-term effects live, not in the headlines, in the quiet assessments, the internal reports, the meetings that happen behind closed doors. And in a year or two, when China decides whether to invest more in flood control or divert those funds elsewhere, that decision will be shaped by what happens this week. So pay attention. I know it's easy to scroll past this story. It's easy to say, Typhoon in China, nothing new. It's easy to go back to your life. But what's happening in southern China right now is a preview of a world where extreme weather becomes more frequent, where governments are forced to respond more often, where the systems we rely on get tested again and again. And the question that should keep you up at night isn't, will the levees hold in Guangdong? It's, will the levees hold everywhere? Because they're not just walls of concrete and steel. They're walls of trust. Trust in institutions. Trust in leadership. Trust that someone is in charge and knows what they're doing. And that trust, that's the most fragile thing of all. So I'm going to leave you with this. I don't know how bad this storm is going to be. I don't know if it's going to be the one that makes headlines or the one that fades from memory. I don't know if the emergency response is going to be perfect or flawed. But I do know that the people in those provinces are going to be scared. And they're going to look to their government, and they're going to ask themselves the same question people ask everywhere when things get hard. Are you going to protect me? Do you have this? Can I trust you? That's what this is really about. That's the question that hangs over every emergency. And tomorrow morning, when the typhoon makes landfall, we'll start to get our answer. Not for them, for all of us. Because the lesson isn't about China. The lesson is about how fragile systems are, how quickly things go wrong, and how much we need to be ready for the next storm. I'll be watching closely. I think you should too. This isn't over. It's never over. We're in a time when everything feels big and unsettled and unpredictable. And the best we can do is pay attention, think clearly, and be honest with ourselves about what we're seeing. I'll be here when the news breaks, and I'll walk you through it the same way I try to walk you through everything. Take care of yourself, and if you're in southern China, my God, stay safe. We'll talk again soon.